Drums in the Night. The Curse That Haunts. Summary. In a remote village shrouded in mystery, a routine frog hunt spirals into a chilling encounter with the supernatural. Alan and Thomas, two villagers, venture out into the moonlit night, drawn by the promise of a fruitful catch. However, their path leads them dangerously close to an ancient burial mound, a site cursed by dark tales of restless spirits. The eerie sound of drumming and ghostly wails warns them too late of the presence they have disturbed. Confronted by a spectral woman wielding a battered drum, they are commanded to leave or face the wrath of the vengeful dead. Pursued by haunting sounds and twisting shadows, the men flee back to the village, shaken and terrified. Their ordeal serves as a grim reminder of the village's cursed history, where the echoes of past atrocities linger in the night. Though they escape with their lives, the drumming continues, a haunting melody that binds the living to the memories of the restless spirits. This is a tale of fear, regret, and the thin veil separating the living from the dead, reminding all that some places and secrets are better left undisturbed. Part 1. A moonlit departure. The crescent moon hung low over the sleepy village, its silver light bathing the thatched roofs in an ethereal glow. Shadows stretched long and dark, twisting over cobblestone paths and the swaying treetops beyond. The air was cool but heavy, thick with the kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand on end. Alan tightened his grip on the worn handle of his lantern, its flickering flame casting a jittery light. He glanced over at Thomas, who walked beside him, his gait steady but his eyes darting nervously toward the forest ahead. They'd done this many times before, heading out into the night to hunt frogs by the river. It was a familiar chore, a small task to supplement their meager income. Yet tonight felt different, as though the very air vibrated with unspoken warnings. "You're quiet tonight," Alan muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was hushed, almost as if he feared being overheard. Thomas shrugged, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Just thinking. The stories the old folks tell. About the mound. They've been on my mind." Alan snorted, though it lacked conviction. "Superstitions. Ghost stories to keep kids from wandering too far. We're grown men, Thomas. There's nothing out here but frogs and mud still." His eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the distant tree line where the shadows seemed unnaturally dense. He quickened his pace, eager to reach the riverbank and get to work. The two men fell into an uneasy silence, their boots squelching through damp earth as they crossed the village's outskirts. The night was eerily still. Even the usual chorus of crickets and distant hoots of owls seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ahead, the river glimmered faintly, reflecting the pale moonlight like a ribbon of molten silver. It should have been a comforting sight, but instead it felt distant, as though the river belonged to another world entirely. Thomas paused, his hand on Alan's arm. "Do you hear that?" Alan stopped, tilting his head. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then it came faint and far away, a rhythmic, hollow drumming. It was barely audible, like the echo of a heartbeat against the stillness of the night. "It's probably the wind," Alan said, though his voice faltered. Nothing to worry about, but Thomas's face was pale, his knuckles white as he clutched his net. "The mound is that way," he whispered. "My grandmother used to say the drumming starts when they're restless." Alan scoffed, though the words sent a shiver down his spine. "What, ghosts banging on their drums? Get a hold of yourself, Thomas. Let's just get to the river and be done with it." Reluctantly, Thomas followed as Alan led the way, the drumming growing louder with each step. It was no longer faint, no longer ignorable. The sound resonated in their chests, each beat like a hand pressing against their ribs. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm, deliberate and unyielding, as if calling out to something unseen. The riverbank was darker than usual, the moon's light struggling to pierce the dense canopy above. Alan lit his lantern, the warm glow pushing back the shadows just enough to illuminate their surroundings. He tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning the ground for movement, but the drumming lingered, a sinister soundtrack to their hunt. "Let's split up," Alan said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We'll cover more ground that way. Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the direction of the mound. I don't think we should. Don't be ridiculous, Alan snapped, more out of fear than anger. We'll be done faster. Go on. I'll stay near the river with visible reluctance. Thomas moved off into the underbrush, his lantern swinging like a lonely firefly in the distance. Alan watched him go, the weight of solitude pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. He crouched by the water, the faint croak of frogs a welcome distraction from the drumming. His hands moved on instinct, reaching out to grab his quarry. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the stories he'd dismissed so easily. Tales of vengeful spirits, of travelers who never returned, of a cursed mound where the dead were said to rise. The drumming grew louder. Alan froze, his breath hitching. It was no longer distant. It was here, surrounding him, reverberating through the very ground beneath his feet. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands. Thomas, he called, his voice trembling. No answer. The drumming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed even the sound of his own breathing. Alan's heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears like a desperate plea. He gripped his lantern tightly, its light suddenly feeble against the encroaching darkness. A sound broke the silence, not the drumming, but something else. A low, mournful wail, rising and falling like the wind through a hollow reed. It came from the direction Thomas had gone. Panic surged through Alan. He ran toward the sound, his feet slipping on the damp earth. The lantern swung wildly in his hand, casting frantic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. He stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. There, illuminated by the flickering light, was a figure. A woman, her hair wild and tangled, her face pale and gaunt. She stood motionless, her hollow eyes fixed on him. In her hands, she held a drum, its surface worn and cracked. Who disturbs the mound? She hissed, her voice a rasping whisper that cut through the air like a blade. Alan couldn't speak, couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground, his body paralyzed by a fear so profound it stole his breath. The woman raised the drum, her skeletal hands striking it with deliberate, unyielding beats. The sound was no longer hollow, it was deafening, each beat a hammer against his chest. The shadows around her moved, coalescing into grotesque shapes. Faces formed and dissolved, their mouths open in silent screams. Alan's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Thomas. His friend lay crumpled on the ground, his lantern extinguished, his face pale and bloodless. Alan's paralysis broke and he staggered backward, his voice finally finding him. "Stay back," he shouted, though the words sounded weak, even to him. The woman's eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a chilling smile. "Leave," she commanded, her voice rising to a deafening roar. "Or you will join the restless." Alan turned and ran, his legs burning with effort as he tore through the underbrush. The drumming chased him, relentless and unyielding, each beat a reminder of the horror he'd left behind. Branches clawed at his face and clothes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he finally burst into the village, the sound ceased. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind racing with images of the spectral woman and the lifeless body of his friend. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with worry and fear. An elderly woman approached, her eyes scanning his face. "The mound," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Alan nodded, unable to speak. The woman's face darkened. "You've disturbed the restless. Pray they let you live." Her words hung in the air, a grim prophecy that chilled Alan to his core. He knew, even as the villagers helped him to his feet, that he would never forget the sound of the drum or the sight of the woman who played it. Part 2. The drumming begins. As the two men approached the riverbank, the once faint drumming grew louder, a hollow and rhythmic sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual nocturnal symphony of crickets and frogs replaced by an oppressive silence. Each step felt heavier, as if the very air thickened around them. Alan tightened his grip on his lantern, the flickering light providing little comfort. "Probably just someone messing around," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his unease. Thomas stopped abruptly, his head tilted, as if trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "It's coming from the mound," he whispered, his words barely audible over the steady beat. His face was pale, his breath shallow. "We shouldn't be here, Alan." "We've heard the stories." Alan rolled his eyes, though he couldn't hide his own growing anxiety. "Stories, Thomas. Just stories. Don't let an old wives' tale spook you. We're here for frogs, not ghosts." But even as he spoke, Alan felt a chill run down his spine. The drumming wasn't random. It had a rhythm, deliberate and unsettling, like a heartbeat echoing in the night. It pulled at something primal within him, a whisper of danger that he tried to ignore. The river came into view, its surface shimmering under the pale moonlight. Normally the sight would have been a relief, a promise of productive hunting and a quick return home. But tonight the river's reflective surface seemed unnatural, as though it were a barrier to another world. Thomas hesitated at the edge of the water, his lantern held high. "Alan, I can't do this. Not tonight." "Something's wrong." Alan turned to face him, his jaw tightening. "We're already here. Let's just get this done and leave. You'll feel better once we're back in the village." Thomas didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted toward the direction of the mound, shrouded in darkness and mystery. Finally, he nodded, though his grip on his net was shaky. Together they began their work, moving along the riverbank in search of frogs. The drumming didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. Alan tried to block it out, focusing on the task at hand. But each time he reached for a frog, the beat would reverberate through his chest, shaking his concentration. He glanced at Thomas, who was visibly trembling, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. "Let's split up," Alan suggested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We'll cover more ground that way." Thomas stared at him, incredulous. "Are you serious? You want to split up now?" Alan forced a laugh. "What, scared of the dark? Come on, Thomas. We'll be done faster." Reluctantly, Thomas relented, moving a few yards downstream. Alan stayed closer to the water, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the trees. He tried to focus, but the drumming was relentless, a sinister soundtrack to their hunt. The rhythm seemed to change, becoming sharper, more urgent, as if trying to communicate something. Then, it stopped. Alan froze, his heart pounding in the sudden silence. The absence of the drumming was almost worse than its presence. He turned his head slowly, scanning the darkness. The forest seemed unnaturally still, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. A low, mournful wail broke the silence. It came from the direction Thomas had gone, rising and falling like the wind through a hollow reed. Alan's breath hitched. "Thomas," he called, his voice trembling. No response. The wail grew louder, closer. Alan's instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't leave Thomas. Gripping his lantern tightly, he moved toward the sound, each step feeling like a battle against invisible forces. The underbrush seemed to close in around him, branches clawing at his clothes and skin. He stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. There, illuminated by the faint glow of his lantern, was a figure. A woman, her hair wild and matted, her skin as pale as the moonlight. She stood perfectly still, her eyes hollow and fixed on him. In her hands she held a drum, its surface worn and cracked. "Who disturbs the mound?" she hissed, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the air like a blade. Alan couldn't speak, couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground, his body paralyzed by a fear so profound it stole his breath. The woman raised the drum, her skeletal hands striking it with deliberate, unyielding beats. The sound was deafening, each beat a hammer against his chest. The shadows around her moved, coalescing into grotesque shapes. Faces formed and dissolved, their mouths open in silent screams. Alan's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. From the corner of his eye, he saw Thomas. His friend lay crumpled on the ground, his lantern extinguished, his face pale and bloodless. Alan's paralysis broke and he staggered backward, his voice finally finding him. "Stay back," he shouted, though the words sounded weak, even to him. The woman's eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a chilling smile. "Leave," she commanded, her voice rising to a deafening roar. "Or you will join the restless." Alan turned and ran, his legs burning with effort as he tore through the underbrush. The drumming chased him, relentless and unyielding, each beat a reminder of the horror he'd left behind. Branches clawed at his face and clothes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he finally burst into the village, the sound ceased. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind racing with images of the spectral woman and the lifeless body of his friend. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with worry and fear. Alan's cry for help brought the elderly out first, their weathered faces masks of dread. The village was steeped in its superstitions, and even those who scoffed at tales of spirits could not ignore the fear in Alan's wide eyes and trembling hands. "What happened?" asked an elderly man, his voice shaky. Alan clutched his knees, breathless, unable to summon words. Another woman grabbed his shoulder, shaking him slightly as she demanded an answer. "T." The drum. Alan stuttered, pointing toward the forest. His voice barely rose above a whisper. The mound. A collective gasp spread through the crowd, and a murmur of alarm surged like an incoming tide. "The mound," muttered an older woman, clutching her shawl tighter around her thin frame. "I told them no one goes there at night." The spirits wake. When disturbed, Alan collapsed, shaking. Before anyone could press him further, the faint echo of the drumming reached their ears. The crowd turned as one, staring into the dense woods. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and all fell silent. Part 3. Uneasy shadows. The air grew colder, biting through their thin clothes, as if the night itself had come alive. Alan's lantern flickered wildly, casting shadows that twisted and danced on the gnarled trunks around them. He glanced over at Thomas, whose trembling hands barely held onto his net. The forest seemed alive, every rustle and creak amplified by their shared fear. "The drumming. It's getting louder," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the persistent, hollow beat that reverberated through the trees. "It's like it knows we're here." Alan didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, his heart pounding in his chest, as the weight of the village's old legends pressed heavily on him. Tales of the mound and its restless spirits, stories he had dismissed as superstition, now felt all too real. The lantern's light dimmed again, plunging them momentarily into near darkness. Alan shook it roughly, his fingers slick with sweat, and the flame surged back to life. The faint glow revealed the twisted branches above, their claw-like forms reaching down as if to ensnare them. The shadows they cast seemed to mock the men, stretching unnaturally, curling into grotesque shapes that resembled faces, leering, gaping, screaming. "We should go back," Thomas said, his voice cracking. He stopped walking and turned toward Alan, his wide eyes filled with desperation. "Please, Alan. Forget the frogs. Let's just go." Alan hesitated. A part of him wanted to agree, to turn back and leave the oppressive woods behind. But his pride and stubbornness refused to yield. "We're almost done," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll grab a few more and head home. Don't let some old ghost story scare you." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden crackling sound made both men freeze. The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving a void of silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. Alan raised the lantern, its trembling light barely piercing the dense shadows ahead. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was not the spectral woman they had seen before, but something far worse. A grotesque silhouette, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. The faint light caught its hollow eyes and jagged grin, a face that seemed stitched together from nightmares. It stood motionless, its presence suffocating. "Who's there?" Alan croaked, his voice breaking. He tried to sound authoritative, but his trembling hands betrayed his fear. The figure did not move. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, the drumming resumed. But this time it was closer, louder, more frenzied, as if whatever was beating that cursed drum was growing impatient. Thomas backed away, his feet crunching on the brittle leaves below. "Alan, let's run." Now Alan wanted to argue, to insist they stay calm, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The figure shifted slightly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. That was enough. Without another word, Alan turned and ran, his lantern swinging wildly and casting chaotic streaks of light. Thomas was right behind him, their panicked breaths and pounding footsteps blending with the relentless drumming. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in as if trying to trap them. Roots reached up to snag their feet, branches clawed at their faces, and the ground itself seemed to shift under their weight. The drumming grew louder, impossibly loud, drowning out everything else. Alan's heart felt like it would burst, each beat syncing with the cursed rhythm that pursued them. He dared not look back, but he could feel it, the figure. Or perhaps many figures closing in on them, their presence cold and oppressive. They burst into a small clearing, gasping for air. The drumming stopped again, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed to press down on their ears. Alan collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest as he struggled to catch his breath. Thomas stood nearby, his wide eyes scanning the shadows that ringed the clearing. "It's gone," Thomas whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. It didn't follow us. Alan wanted to believe him, but his gut told him otherwise. The silence wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that came before something terrible. He stood shakily, raising the lantern again. The flame flickered weakly, barely holding on, but it was enough to reveal the edge of the clearing. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was the figure. It was closer now, its twisted form more grotesque than before. The jagged grin seemed to stretch wider, and its hollow eyes locked onto Alan's. It raised a hand, bony and clawed, and pointed directly at him. Alan felt his legs give out, his body refusing to move. The drumming started again, slow and deliberate, each beat sending a jolt of terror through his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its movements disjointed but purposeful. Thomas grabbed Alan's arm, yanking him to his feet. "Move," he shouted, his voice breaking the spell of terror that had paralyzed Alan. Together, they ran again, their feet pounding against the uneven ground. The drumming followed, relentless and unforgiving, its rhythm quickening, as if spurring them onward. They didn't stop until they reached the riverbank, the pale moonlight reflecting off the water like molten silver. Alan collapsed again, his legs trembling too much to hold him. Thomas crouched beside him, both men panting heavily as they tried to process what had just happened. "What was that?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" Alan shook his head, unable to form words. His mind raced, replaying the grotesque image of the figure, the hollow eyes, the twisted grin. It was no ghost. It was something far worse. The drumming stopped once more, but the silence offered no comfort. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the forest itself were waiting for the next move. Alan forced himself to his feet, his grip tightening on the lantern. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." "Before it finds us again," Thomas nodded, his face pale and drawn. Together they turned toward the path that would lead them back to the village. But as they took their first steps, a new sound reached their ears, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. It came from the shadows behind them, from the direction of the clearing. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The growl was enough to spur them into a desperate sprint, their legs burning with effort as they tore through the forest. The growl grew louder, closer, accompanied by the relentless drumming that now felt like it was inside their very heads. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the faint lights of the village, it felt like a miracle. They didn't stop until they reached the first house, collapsing against its wooden wall as they gasped for air. The drumming had stopped, and the growl was gone, but the terror lingered, etched into their faces and seared into their minds. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces filled with worry and curiosity. Alan and Thomas could barely speak, their voices trembling as they tried to explain what had happened. But the words felt inadequate, unable to convey the sheer horror of what they had seen and felt. An elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered face grim. "The mound," she said, her voice heavy with foreboding. "You disturbed it, didn't you?" Alan nodded weakly, unable to meet her gaze. The woman sighed, shaking her head. "You've brought its attention to the village. Pray it does not linger." Her words sent a fresh wave of fear through the gathered crowd. The villagers began murmuring among themselves, their voices tinged with panic. Alan and Thomas could only sit there, their minds reeling as they tried to comprehend the nightmare they had unleashed. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the drumming began again. Part 4. A ghostly encounter. A mournful wail pierced the stillness of the night. A sound so raw and haunting that it seemed to seep into the very marrow of their bones. Alan and Thomas froze mid-step, their breath hitching as the wail rose in intensity, transforming into a scream that echoed through the trees. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was a sound born of anguish and rage, an unearthly cry that turned their blood cold. The drumming stopped abruptly, as if silenced by the scream. The forest grew unnaturally still, the oppressive silence broken only by the pounding of their hearts. Thomas clutched Alan's arm, his grip tight with terror. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before Alan could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. She seemed to glide rather than walk, her movements eerily fluid. Her face was pale, almost translucent, glowing faintly in the lantern's flickering light. Long, dark hair cascaded around her shoulders, framing hollow eyes that burned with a cold, unnatural light. She wore tattered robes that billowed as though stirred by an unseen wind, and in her hands she held a small, weathered drum. Alan's legs felt like they had turned to stone. His instinct to flee warred with the paralyzing fear that held him in place. "It's her," Thomas breathed, his voice barely audible. "The woman from the stories, the keeper of the mound." The spectral woman stopped a few feet away from them, her hollow gaze fixed on the two men. Her presence was suffocating, the air around her heavy and cold. When she spoke, her voice was a rasping whisper, yet it carried an authority that made their knees buckle. "You dare disturb the mound," she hissed, her words dripping with venom. The drum in her hand shifted slightly, her fingers caressing its surface as though it were alive. "You trespass where the restless sleep. Speak, mortals. Why have you come?" Thomas fell to his knees, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Please, we were only hunting. We didn't mean to disturb anything." Alan remained standing, though his legs felt weak. He forced himself to speak, his voice steadier than he expected. "We're sorry. We'll leave now and never return. Please, let us go." The woman's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as the faint glow around her intensified. "Words are wind," she said, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "The restless cannot be so easily appeased. Your presence here has awakened them. And now, they hunger." She raised the drum, her skeletal fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent chills coursing through their bodies. With each beat, the shadows around them deepened, twisting and writhing as if alive. Faces began to form within the darkness, gaunt, hollow-eyed specters whose mouths gaped in silent screams. They pressed closer, their forms flickering like smoke yet exuding a palpable malice. Thomas screamed, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "No. Stay away," he cried, his voice raw with panic. The specters advanced, their hollow eyes fixed on the two men. Alan reached down and grabbed Thomas by the arm, yanking him to his feet. "Run," Alan shouted, his voice breaking through Thomas's terror. Together they turned and fled, their feet pounding against the uneven ground as the shadows surged after them. The spectral woman's drumming grew louder, faster, each beat driving the apparitions closer. The forest seemed to conspire against them. Roots and branches reached out to trip and ensnare, and the air grew colder with each step. Alan's lantern swung wildly, its feeble light barely holding the darkness at bay. The specters were relentless, their gaunt faces and clawed hands emerging from the shadows to grasp at the fleeing men. Thomas stumbled, nearly falling, but Alan caught him and dragged him forward. "Don't stop," Alan shouted, his own fear driving him onward. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but the terror behind them was greater than any physical pain. The drumming was deafening now, a frenzied rhythm that seemed to echo inside their skulls. Alan glanced over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The spectral woman was gliding through the trees, her glowing eyes locked on them. Behind her, the specters writhed and twisted, their forms growing more defined with each passing moment. Ahead, the forest thinned, and Alan caught a glimpse of the river. There he gasped, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there." They broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the riverbank, collapsing onto the cold, damp ground. Alan's lantern slipped from his grasp, rolling to a stop a few feet away. The flame flickered weakly, but didn't go out. The drumming stopped. For a moment there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. Alan pushed himself up, his body trembling, and looked back toward the forest. The shadows lingered at the edge of the trees, shifting and swirling like a living thing. The spectral woman stood among them, her pale face expressionless as she watched them. "You cannot escape the restless," she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "You have crossed the threshold. They will find you. No matter where you go with that." She raised her drum one final time. A single, thunderous beat echoed through the night, and the shadows surged forward, flooding the riverbank like an inky tide. Alan grabbed the lantern and hauled Thomas to his feet. "Move," he shouted, his voice raw. They stumbled along the riverbank, their feet slipping on the wet stones. The shadows followed, undeterred by the water, their cold presence chilling the air. Up ahead, the faint lights of the village came into view. The sight gave Alan a surge of hope, and he pushed himself harder, half dragging Thomas as they sprinted toward safety. The shadows slowed but did not stop, lingering at the edge of the river, as if bound by an unseen barrier. Alan and Thomas collapsed onto the dirt road at the village's edge, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The villagers began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Their faces were a mixture of concern and fear as they gathered around the two men. "What happened?" one of them asked, his voice laced with unease. Alan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Thomas was sobbing quietly, his face buried in his hands. An elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered face grim. "You went to the mound, didn't you?" she said, her voice heavy with resignation. Alan nodded weakly, his eyes wide with lingering terror. The woman sighed, shaking her head. "Fools! You've brought its curse upon us all." The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their murmurs growing louder. Alan struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady. "We didn't mean to," he said, his voice hoarse. "We didn't know." "It doesn't matter," the woman interrupted. "The restless have been awakened. They will not stop until they are satisfied." Her words sent a fresh wave of panic through the crowd. The villagers began to disperse, hurrying back to their homes and locking their doors. Alan and Thomas were left standing alone on the dirt road, the weight of the woman's warning pressing heavily on them. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, the drumming began again. Part 5. The Curse Unleashed. The spectral woman struck her drum with deliberate force, and the ground beneath Alan and Thomas's feet seemed to heave in protest. A chilling wind howled through the trees, carrying with it whispers that were neither words nor sounds but something far worse: raw anguish. A language of the damned. Around her, shadows surged and twisted, taking on grotesque forms that writhed like smoke given sinister life. Alan stumbled backward, his lantern quivering in his hand, its faint light flickering as though cowering from the encroaching dark. The air grew heavier, colder, suffocating. Beside him, Thomas clutched at his arm, his pale face contorted in sheer terror. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, his body rigid, as if frozen by an invisible force. "You have trespassed where none are welcome," the spectral woman hissed. Her voice was low yet carried an authority that struck their very souls. "You have stirred the slumbering, and now you shall pay." Her words struck like daggers, reverberating in the oppressive air. Around her, the shadows grew darker, denser, coalescing into monstrous shapes. Faces emerged from the swirling blackness, faces contorted in agony, their hollow eyes burning with hatred. Skeletal hands reached outward, clawing at the space between them and the two men. Each movement of the shadowy forms was deliberate, menacing, as though savoring the hunt. "Leave," the woman bellowed, her voice splitting the night. The drum in her hands resonated with a deafening boom, sending shock waves rippling through the clearing. "Or join the restless." The ground split open at her feet, and the earth groaned as though in pain. A dark fissure spread outward, cracking the dirt and exposing an abyss that glowed faintly red, as if lit from below by the fires of the underworld. From its depths came a guttural roar, a sound so primal and filled with fury that Alan's knees nearly buckled beneath him. "Alan," Thomas screamed, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony. "Run. Please, we have to run." But Alan couldn't move. His legs felt as though they were rooted to the spot, his body paralyzed by the sheer force of the nightmare unfolding before him. The spectral woman raised her drum again, her hollow eyes fixed on him. The rhythm quickened, a chaotic, frenzied beat that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat, threatening to drive him mad. Thomas grabbed Alan's arm, shaking him violently. "Alan, for God's sake, move." The desperation in Thomas's voice broke through the fog of terror clouding Alan's mind. He gasped for breath and forced his legs to obey, turning toward the faint path that led back to the village. "Go," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Run." They sprinted into the dense forest, their feet pounding against the uneven ground. Branches lashed at their faces, and roots seemed to rise from the earth, grasping at their ankles. Behind them, the shadows surged forward, their grotesque forms moving with unnatural fluidity. The drumming followed, relentless and deafening, a cruel cadence that drove them deeper into the darkness. Thomas tripped over a gnarled root and fell hard, his body slamming into the cold, damp earth. He cried out in pain, clutching at his leg. Alan skidded to a stop, his chest heaving, and turned back to help his friend. "Get up," he shouted, grabbing Thomas under the arms and hauling him to his feet. "We can't stop," Thomas whimpered, his face twisted in agony. "I can't. My leg." Alan gritted his teeth and looped Thomas's arm over his shoulder, half dragging him forward. "We're not dying here," he growled. "Keep moving." The shadows drew closer, their clawed hands reaching out. The air around them grew colder, biting into their skin like frost. Alan felt the presence of the specters closing in, their guttural moans filling his ears. He forced himself forward, each step a monumental effort, as the weight of terror threatened to crush him. Ahead, the faint glimmer of the river came into view. Alan's heart leapt with a fragile hope. "The water," he gasped. "They can't cross the water." The riverbank was slippery and uneven, but they stumbled onto it, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Alan lowered Thomas to the ground and turned to face the encroaching shadows. The lantern's feeble light cast long, trembling beams, barely illuminating the forest's edge. The shadows hesitated, writhing at the tree line, as if bound by an unseen barrier. Thomas collapsed onto his side, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Are we safe?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing water. Alan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the spectral woman, who stood just beyond the shadows. Her glowing eyes burned with an intensity that made Alan's blood run cold. The drum hung limply in her hands, but the air around her shimmered with a dark energy, pulsating like a heartbeat. "You think the river will save you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The restless are patient. They will wait. They will follow. No barrier will stop them." The ground beneath their feet trembled again, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Alan felt the lantern slip from his grasp as the riverbank began to crack and shift. A jagged fissure tore through the earth, its edges glowing with a faint, hellish light. From its depths came the sound of something massive stirring, a low, guttural growl that resonated in their chests. Thomas screamed as the ground beneath him gave way, dragging him toward the abyss. Alan lunged forward, grabbing his friend's arm just as he began to slip into the void. "Hold on," Alan shouted, his muscles straining as he fought to pull Thomas back. The shadows surged forward, their clawed hands reaching into the fissure. They grasped at Thomas's legs, their skeletal fingers digging into his flesh. Thomas's screams grew louder, his body thrashing in desperation. "Don't let go," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "I won't," Alan growled through gritted teeth. With one final, desperate effort, he yanked Thomas free, sending them both sprawling onto the ground. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the fissure as it began to close. The spectral woman let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound so filled with rage and sorrow that Alan felt his eardrums would burst. The forest fell silent once more. Alan and Thomas lay motionless on the cold, damp ground, their chests heaving as they struggled to catch their breath. The lantern's flame had gone out, leaving them in near total darkness save for the faint glow of the moon. Alan, Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. What was that?" Alan didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the spectral woman, who stood motionless at the forest's edge. Her hollow gaze bored into him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she raised her drum and struck it once more. The single, resonant beat echoed through the night, sending a ripple through the air that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. The shadows retreated, dissolving into the forest as if drawn back into the depths of the mound. The spectral woman began to fade, her form growing faint and translucent. Before she disappeared completely, her voice echoed through the air, soft yet filled with ominous finality. "The curse is not broken. The restless will come. And when they do, no light will save you." With that, she vanished, leaving the two men alone on the riverbank. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, but the lingering dread remained. Alan pushed himself to his feet, his body aching and his mind racing. "We have to get back to the village," he said, his voice hoarse. Now Thomas nodded weakly, allowing Alan to help him to his feet. Together, they stumbled away from the river, their legs heavy with exhaustion. The faint lights of the village beckoned in the distance, a fragile promise of safety. But as they walked, the faint echo of the drum followed them, a haunting reminder that the curse was far from over. Part 6. The Frantic Escape. Alan and Thomas ran as if the night itself had risen to swallow them. The forest around them blurred into a maze of gnarled branches and clawing shadows. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, punctuated by the persistent drumming and guttural wails that seemed to grow louder with every step. The lantern Alan carried flickered precariously, its feeble light casting jittery, distorted shapes on the trees. Then, with a sudden, sputtering gasp, the flame died, plunging them into utter darkness. "Keep going," Alan barked, though his voice betrayed his own terror. His hands grasped at Thomas's arm, steering his stumbling friend through the unseen terrain. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a branch, the distant echoes of the drum felt amplified, oppressive. The shadows seemed alive, pressing closer, their malevolent whispers brushing against their ears. "I can't see," Thomas cried, his voice cracking with desperation. His foot snagged on a root, and he went down hard, pulling Alan with him. They landed in the damp earth, their hands scrabbling for purchase as the eerie drumming paused for a brief, horrifying moment. And then it returned faster, louder, pounding like a heart about to burst. The sound wasn't just around them, it was inside them, resonating in their skulls and threatening to drive them mad. Alan hauled Thomas upright, his grip unrelenting. "We don't stop. We keep moving." A new sound joined the cacophony, a low, guttural growl that seemed to rumble from the very earth. Alan's stomach turned as he realized it wasn't coming from one direction but all around them. He turned sharply, his eyes searching the suffocating darkness for any sign of safety. But there was nothing, only the endless, shifting black. Suddenly, a pale light flickered ahead. For a moment, Alan thought it was the village, a beacon of salvation. But as they stumbled closer, the truth became horribly clear. The light emanated from a figure, the spectral woman, her hollow eyes glowing with cold fury. Her translucent form hovered above the ground, her tattered robes billowing unnaturally in the still air. In her hands, she held the drum, its surface pulsing faintly with every beat. "You cannot flee," she intoned, her voice echoing unnaturally. "The restless have awakened. They hunger for what was stolen." Alan's knees buckled, the weight of her words crushing his resolve. Thomas whimpered beside him, his body trembling. The spectral woman raised her drum, striking it with skeletal hands. The sound rippled through the air, and from the shadows shapes began to emerge. Figures formed from the darkness itself, their faces twisted into masks of anguish and rage. Hollow eyes locked onto the two men as clawed hands reached forward. No, Alan screamed, dragging Thomas to his feet. The figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though propelled by some unseen force. The spectral woman's drumming grew more frenzied, each beat driving the shadows closer. Alan and Thomas sprinted blindly, their bodies running on sheer instinct. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and writhe, as if trying to swallow them whole. Alan stumbled over an exposed root but caught himself, his grip on Thomas unyielding. "We're almost there," he shouted, though he didn't know if it was true. The words felt hollow even as they left his lips. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning inward like malevolent sentinels. Alan's mind raced with every step, replaying the villagers' warnings, the legends of the mound, the cursed drum. He had dismissed them all as stories, superstition. Now, he cursed his own arrogance. This was no story. This was death reaching for them. The drumming shifted again, the rhythm changing into something more chaotic, more insistent. Alan glanced over his shoulder and nearly tripped. The spectral figures were closer now, their faces more defined, their mouths opening in soundless screams. Their hands clawed at the air, and though they moved without haste, they seemed to gain on the men with every step. Thomas faltered, his legs buckling. "I can't," he gasped, collapsing to his knees. "I can't. Alan, I can't." Alan skidded to a stop, panic surging through him. He grabbed Thomas by the collar, shaking him. "You can. Get up. We're not dying here." Thomas's wide, tear-filled eyes met Alan's, and for a moment it seemed as though he would give in to the despair. But then, from somewhere deep within, he found a shred of strength. With Alan's help, he rose, his legs wobbling like a newborn fawn's. Together, they pushed forward. A faint orange glow appeared in the distance. Alan's heart leapt. The village. The safety of light, of people, of walls that could keep the darkness at bay. "We're almost there," he yelled, hope lending strength to his tired limbs. "Thomas, look." The village Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the light. He stumbled forward with renewed determination, leaning heavily on Alan as they broke through the last of the trees. The village gates loomed ahead, their rough wooden planks a welcome sight. The drumming faltered. The guttural growls receded. The spectral figures stopped at the forest's edge, their hollow eyes watching as Alan and Thomas collapsed onto the dirt road leading into the village. Villagers emerged from their homes, lanterns in hand, their faces etched with worry and confusion. An elderly woman approached, her weathered face grim as she looked down at the two men. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice heavy with accusation. Alan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His chest heaved, his lungs burning. Thomas sobbed quietly, his face buried in his hands. The villagers' murmurs grew louder, their fear palpable. "You went to the mound," the woman said, her tone laced with dread. "You disturbed the drum." Alan nodded weakly, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't mean to," he choked out. "We didn't know." The woman shook her head. "It doesn't matter. The restless have awakened. Their hunger cannot be sated so easily." Her words sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children, men exchanged worried glances, and the elderly whispered prayers under their breath. Alan pushed himself upright, his body trembling. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do we stop it?" The woman's eyes darkened. "You can't," she said simply. "The curse has been unleashed. All we can do is wait and hope they are merciful." A chilling wind swept through the village, extinguishing the lanterns one by one. The drumming began anew, faint but insistent, echoing from the forest like a heartbeat in the darkness. The villagers retreated to their homes, their doors and windows slamming shut. Alan and Thomas were left alone on the road, the weight of the curse pressing down on them. The spectral figures lingered at the forest's edge, their hollow eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. And from deep within the trees, The spectral woman's voice carried softly on the wind. You cannot escape the restless. The drum will sound until the debt is paid. The two men stared into the darkness, the haunting rhythm of the drum echoing in their ears. The village behind them offered little solace. They knew, as did the villagers, that the curse would not end with the dawn. Part 7. The village awakens. Back in the village, the drumming seemed to linger in the distance, faint but unyielding, as if mocking the newfound silence. Alan and Thomas, trembling and exhausted, sat slumped on the dirt road. Their frantic escape had drawn a crowd. Villagers emerged cautiously, lanterns casting warm circles of light onto the cold ground. Concerned whispers rippled through the gathering. "What's happened?" one man asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Why do you look as if you've seen death itself?" An elderly woman stepped forward, her face weathered by years of hardship and worry. Her piercing gaze scanned Alan and Thomas, reading their terror with unnerving clarity. She knelt beside them, her arthritic hands resting on Alan's trembling shoulder. "You went to the mound," she said softly, but it wasn't a question. Her words carried the weight of certainty and dread. Alan nodded, his throat too tight to form words. Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he whispered, "We didn't know. We didn't mean to disturb it." The woman's expression darkened. "It doesn't matter if you meant to. The mound is sacred and cursed. You've stirred the restless. The drum has sounded, and now they will not stop until their hunger is satisfied." Her words silenced the murmurs of the villagers. Fear etched itself into their faces. A young mother clutched her child closer, while an old man muttered prayers under his breath. Someone asked, "Is there no way to stop it?" The woman shook her head solemnly. "There is no stopping them. Long ago, the mound became a place of torment, soaked in blood and sorrow. The spirits bound to it are cursed, forever yearning for vengeance." One of the younger villagers stepped forward, his voice sharp with frustration. "Then tell us, elder. What happened at the mound? Why does it hold such power?" The elderly woman hesitated, her gaze distant, as if staring into a past that refused to be forgotten. Finally, she began to speak, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The history of the mound. Many years ago, long before most of you were born, this village was not a place of peace. It was a land of turmoil, constantly under siege from invaders seeking to claim its fertile soil. One such war brought a band of mercenaries to our doorstep. They were ruthless, leaving destruction wherever they went. When they arrived here, our ancestors had little choice but to surrender. The mercenaries took what they wanted: our crops, our livestock, even our people. Women and children were dragged away, their cries haunting the night. But even that wasn't enough to sate their cruelty. One fateful evening, they gathered the remaining villagers and forced them to the clearing where the mound now stands. They told us it was to be a celebration, but it was no festival. It was a massacre. They slaughtered everyone: men, women, children, and piled their bodies into the earth. Those who resisted were beaten, their screams echoing through the forest. The leader of the mercenaries was a cruel man, a sadist who took pleasure in our suffering. He struck his drum as the killings continued, each beat a cruel reminder of his power. When the last villager fell, the mound was sealed with their blood, but the spirits of the slain did not rest. Their agony and hatred seeped into the earth, binding them to the drum, the very instrument used to mock their final moments. From that day forward, the mound became cursed, a place where the restless lingered, waiting for vengeance. "And now," the woman said, her voice trembling, "you have stirred them. You have awakened their fury." A growing panic, the villagers erupted into a cacophony of fear and anger. Accusations flew, directed at Alan and Thomas for their recklessness. "You've doomed us all," someone shouted. "The spirits will come for us enough," the elder barked, silencing the crowd with a rare show of authority. She turned back to Alan and Thomas, her eyes sharp. "Tell me exactly what happened." Alan recounted their harrowing experience, his voice trembling as he described the spectral woman, the relentless drumming, and the grotesque shadows that pursued them. Each detail seemed to deepen the villagers' horror. When he finished, the elder nodded grimly. "The woman you saw was the keeper of the drum," she said. Her spirit lingers to guard the mound and its cursed relic. She is bound to it, just as the restless are bound to her. The drum's rhythm calls them, and they obey. As long as the drum sounds, the curse will spread. Thomas's voice cracked as he asked, "What do we do? How do we stop it?" The elder's expression grew distant. Stopping the drum is no simple task. To silence it would require confronting the keeper herself, a feat few have dared and none have survived. The drum is her tether to this world and to the restless. Destroying it may free her, but it may also unleash the full fury of those bound to the mound. A heavy silence fell over the gathering. Alan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like a stone. He glanced at Thomas, whose face was pale and streaked with tears. "If we don't stop it," Alan said quietly, "what happens to the village?" The elder's gaze swept over the crowd, her voice grave. "The restless will come. They will take what they believe is owed to them. And when their vengeance is satisfied, they will leave nothing behind." A glimmer of hope. A young girl, no more than 10, stepped forward timidly. Her small hand tugged at the elder's sleeve. "But, elder," she said softly, "what if they don't want to hurt us? What if we can make them happy?" The elder knelt to meet the girl's wide, innocent eyes. "Their anger runs deep, child. It is not so easily soothed." The girl frowned, her small hands twisting in her apron. "But maybe they just need someone to listen. Someone to say they're sorry." Her words struck a chord in the crowd, sparking murmurs of reluctant agreement. Alan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in hours: hope. Perhaps there was a way to confront the curse without violence. Perhaps the spirits could be appeased. The elder straightened, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "It is a dangerous path," she said slowly, "but it may be our only chance." The restless crave acknowledgement, justice for the lives stolen from them. If someone were brave enough to approach the mound and offer penance, perhaps they would listen. Alan's stomach churned at the thought, but he found himself stepping forward. "I'll go," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "We caused this. We'll fix it." Thomas's eyes widened in alarm. "Alan, no. You saw what's out there. We can't face them again." Alan turned to his friend, his expression resolute. "If we don't, the whole village will suffer. We can't let that happen." The elder nodded solemnly. "Then prepare yourselves. The restless will not make it easy. You must tread carefully, speak with respect, and be ready for whatever they demand." As the villagers dispersed, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty, Alan and Thomas remained behind, their hearts heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The faint echo of the drum lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that time was running out. Part 8. The haunting lingers. Even after Alan and Thomas returned to the safety of the village, the drumming persisted. Its faint, rhythmic echoes drifted on the wind, seeping into every corner of the settlement. On moonlit nights, when the shadows stretched long and the air grew heavy, the sound would rise again, carrying with it a palpable dread. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, a reminder that the restless spirits of the mound were far from satisfied. Alan sat by the window of his small home, his hands gripping a cup of tea that had long gone cold. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the dark silhouette of the forest loomed like a specter. Every night he tried to convince himself that the drumming was a trick of the wind, a figment of his frayed nerves. But deep down, he knew better. "They won't stop," he muttered to himself, the words of bitter truth that tasted like ash on his tongue. "Not until—" He couldn't finish the thought. The weight of their failure gnawed at him. They had escaped the mound, but at what cost? The village was now a place of unease, its people moving through their days with heavy hearts and watchful eyes. The lively chatter that once filled the marketplace had given way to hushed conversations and wary glances. Everyone knew the curse was still alive, and everyone feared its eventual reckoning. The drummings reached Thomas, meanwhile, was faring no better. He had become a shadow of his former self, his once boisterous laughter replaced by a haunted silence. He avoided the village square, unwilling to face the accusing stares of those who blamed him and Alan for their plight. Instead, he spent his days in the fields, his hands working the soil with a desperation that bordered on frenzy, as if he could bury his guilt beneath the earth. But the drumming followed him even there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of deep red and purple, Thomas froze mid-swing of his hoe. The sound had begun again, faint but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the forest, the rhythmic beat resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not now." Not here. Dropping his tools, he fled back to the village, his heart pounding in time with the cursed rhythm. When he reached Alan's door, he banged on it with frantic urgency. Alan opened it, his face pale and drawn, as if he too had been listening to the same ghostly melody. "They're coming," Thomas blurted out, his voice shaking. "I heard it again." "It's louder this time," Alan nodded grimly. "I've been hearing it too." "It's getting closer." The two men sat together in silence, their fear a tangible presence in the dimly lit room. Outside, the drumming grew louder, its insistent beat filling the air. The village seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves eerily absent. A village on edge. The next morning, the village awoke to a strange sight. Blackened marks had appeared on the ground near the forest's edge, forming intricate, circular patterns that none could explain. The villagers gathered around them, their faces pale as they murmured prayers and whispered superstitions. The elder arrived, her expression grave as she inspected the markings. "It's a warning," she said, her voice heavy with foreboding. "They're telling us they haven't forgotten." The restless are still watching. The villagers retreated to their homes, locking doors and shuttering windows as if such measures could keep the curse at bay. That night, the drumming returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It echoed through the streets, rattling windows and filling the hearts of the people with an unshakable dread. Alan and Thomas convened with the elder in her small, candlelit home. The flickering light cast deep shadows on her lined face as she spoke. "The restless are growing impatient. Their hunger is not just for vengeance but for acknowledgement. They demand something, perhaps a sacrifice, perhaps a resolution. We cannot ignore them any longer." Alan leaned forward, his fist clenched on the table. "What do we do? We can't let this go on. The village won't survive if this continues." The elder sighed, her weary eyes meeting his. "You must go back to the mound. This time you must face the keeper and offer penance. It's the only way to appease them." Thomas recoiled, his face pale. "Go back? Are you mad? We barely escaped with our lives." "If you don't," the elder said sharply, "the village will pay the price. The restless will consume everything until nothing remains." Preparations for the journey. Reluctantly, Alan and Thomas agreed to return to the mound. The villagers gathered what little they could to help prepare for the dangerous journey. An old hunter provided a bow and a quiver of arrows, though his trembling hands betrayed his doubt that such weapons would be of any use. A healer handed Alan a small pouch of herbs, explaining that they were meant to ward off malevolent spirits. As they stood at the edge of the forest, ready to depart, the elder approached them one last time. She placed a hand on Alan's shoulder, her gaze steady. "Remember," she said, "speak with respect. Offer no lies, no defiance. The restless have no patience for arrogance." Alan nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll do what needs to be done." The elder stepped back, and the villagers watched in silence as the two men disappeared into the trees. The drumming began almost immediately, faint at first but growing louder with every step they took. The forest seemed to close in around them, its shadows darker, its air heavier. The path to the mound was no longer clear, as if the forest itself sought to obscure their way. The haunting remains. As they neared the mound, the drumming reached a fever pitch. The spectral woman appeared once more, her translucent form flickering like a flame. Her hollow eyes fixed on Alan and Thomas, her expression unreadable. She struck the drum with deliberate force, and the shadows around her came alive, twisting into grotesque shapes that writhed with malice. "Why have you returned?" the keeper demanded, her voice echoing with a power that seemed to shake the very ground. "Have you come to offer what is owed?" Alan stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "We've come to make things right. Tell us what you want, and we'll do it." The keeper tilted her head, her hollow eyes narrowing. "Words are easy, mortal. But actions carry weight. Will you sacrifice what is dearest to you? Alan hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. Behind him, Thomas whispered, "We can't do this, Alan. We can't give them what they want," but Alan knew there was no other way. The haunting would not end until the debt was paid. Swallowing his fear, he looked into the keeper's burning gaze and said, "Tell me what you demand, and I will give it." The keeper raised her drum, and the shadows surged forward, their forms merging into a towering figure that loomed over the two men. The air grew colder, and the drumming became a deafening roar. Alan braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. Part 9. A grim warning. The faint light of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues, but the drumming persisted. Its steady rhythm echoed faintly through the village, a haunting reminder that the curse of the mound was far from over. Alan and Thomas sat on the stone steps outside the elder's home, their faces etched with exhaustion and guilt. The events of the past days had left scars far deeper than any wound. "It's over for us," Thomas muttered, his voice hollow. "But they're still there, watching, waiting." Alan nodded grimly, his gaze fixed on the tree line. "We survived, but the village isn't safe. Not while that drum still beats the mound's curse lives on." In the weeks that followed their return, the village struggled to reclaim any sense of normalcy. The marketplace reopened, and children played in the streets, but the shadows of fear lingered. The drumming no longer shook the windows or rattled the air, but it remained a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who listened too closely. Some villagers, emboldened by Alan and Thomas's return, approached the elder, pleading for guidance. "What can we do?" a young woman asked, clutching her child tightly. "The spirits are still out there. What if they come for us next?" The elder's expression was grave as she addressed the crowd. "The spirits are bound to the mound. They watch, yes, but they will not cross the boundaries of the forest unless disturbed again. You must teach your children, your children's children, never to stray too close. Never give them a reason to awaken." Her words became an unspoken law. Parents told their children tales of the restless spirits, warning them to stay clear of the forest's edge. The mound became a forbidden topic, a place never mentioned without whispers and cautious glances. Alan's restlessness. Though the village found ways to move forward, Alan was restless. Each night, he sat by his window, staring toward the forest, waiting for the inevitable. The drumming had grown faint, barely audible, but it was enough to keep him awake. He felt its rhythm in his chest, a ghostly reminder of the horrors he had faced. "Why don't they stop?" he murmured to himself one night. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but Thomas, sitting nearby, answered. "They're waiting," he said quietly, "for someone else to make the same mistake we did." Alan looked at his friend, whose face was pale and drawn. Thomas had taken to drinking heavily, his laughter replaced by bitter silence. The guilt was a heavy burden, one they both carried. "We should have done more," Alan said, his voice tight. "We should have found a way to stop them for good." Thomas shook his head. "And paid with our lives. We barely made it back. Let the village live with the warning. Let it be enough." But for Alan, it wasn't enough. The memory of the spectral woman's hollow eyes, the towering shadows, and the cursed drum haunted him. He knew the mound's curse was a wound that would never heal. Whispers of the spirits. One evening, as the village prepared for the harvest festival, strange events began to unfold. Lanterns placed along the main street flickered and died, their flames extinguished by an unseen force. The air grew colder, and an unnatural fog rolled in from the forest, blanketing the fields in a ghostly shroud. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces pale with fear. The elder stood at the center, her voice steady but urgent. "Stay together," she commanded. "The restless are testing us. Do not give them a reason to cross the boundary." Alan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. What if they don't need a reason? What if they've grown stronger? The elder regarded him with a mix of sympathy and frustration. "The spirits thrive on fear and guilt. The more we dwell on them, the more power we give them. Let tonight pass in silence. Tomorrow we will light the sacred fires and cleanse the village." But Alan wasn't convinced. As the others returned to their homes, he lingered near the forest's edge, his lantern casting a small pool of light in the encroaching fog. The drumming was faint but insistent, its rhythm syncing with his heartbeat. "Why don't you stop?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the lantern. "What more do you want?" A cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a whisper. Alan froze, his breath hitching as the voice grew clearer. "Come back," it said, soft and melodic yet filled with malice. "The debt is not paid." A warning ignored. Alan stumbled backward, his heart racing. He rushed back to the village, his mind racing with the implications of the voice. The elder's words echoed in his head, the restless demand acknowledgement. But how much acknowledgement would ever be enough? The next morning, he told Thomas about the voice. His friend paled but dismissed it. "You're letting them get to you," Thomas said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Ignore it. That's all we can do." Alan wasn't so sure. He began researching the history of the mound, poring over old records and speaking to the oldest villagers. What he uncovered chilled him to the core. The mound had claimed many lives over the years, and each time, the haunting had grown more powerful. It seemed the spirits fed on each mistake, growing stronger with each trespass. "They're not just watching," Alan realized. "They're waiting for the next fool to step too close." And when that happens, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The spirit's eternal vigil. In time, Alan and Thomas's story became legend. The villagers shared it in hushed tones, a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next. The mound remained undisturbed, its shadow stretching long under the moonlight. The faint sound of drumming a constant reminder of the spirit's eternal vigil. Alan left the village years later, unable to bear the weight of his memories. Thomas stayed behind, living a quiet life but never venturing near the forest again. The village thrived in his absence, but the fear of the mound never left. On some nights when the moon was full and the air was still, the drumming would rise again, faint but clear. And though no one dared approach the forest, they all knew one thing: the spirits were still there, watching, waiting, and hungering for the next soul brave or foolish enough to disturb their eternal rest.